Dr. Tim B. Heaton is Professor and Research Associate at the Center for Studies of the Family, Brigham Young University. Received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin at Madison in 1979. As a faculty member of the BYU Sociology Department, Dr. Heaton teaches classes dealing with demographic methods, social statistics, world populations, and social stratification. His interests include studying family changes in less developed countries, marriage and divorce, and demographics of the LDS population. So, Dr. Tim Heaton.
This desk is so big I can't stand behind it. And I'm in the unenviable position of talking just before lunch when we're late, so pass out the mints. I'll try and keep it short, and just remember the teaching, we shouldn't live by bread alone. I love statistics about Mormons and love to study Mormons in that way. I find that sometimes statistics are misused or wrong. Sometimes statistics are created by state agencies, and the agencies themselves determine the numbers as much as what's actually going on. For example, we've heard statistics about child abuse lately. Well, those come from agencies that depend on partly on people's willingness to go in, which depends on whether they're shelters. It depends on how the police deal with the issue and how state agencies deal with police statistics. So I'm not convinced that we have any good data on actual child abuse over time or across states. Other times people misinterpret or use the wrong denominator. For example, I've heard that in the 1860s only 2% of Mormons practiced polygamy. They probably, to get a number that low, use the denominator of everybody in the population. Kids, and everybody. If you just use people in the marriage ages and look at women, it's much higher. It's 30 to 40% from what I've seen. Other times they're close, but kind of use the wrong number. I read not too long ago in the New York Times that Utah has the highest teenage pregnancy rate in the country, and that's not true. Utah has a high birth rate. High teenage birth rate, but a very low abortion rate. So if you add births and abortions to estimate pregnancies, you get about average teenage pregnancy rate. Sometimes the number might be right, but you're not quite sure how to interpret it. Eli Lilly Drug Company released to my friend a few years ago prescriptions for antidepressants. And the rate is higher in Utah than it is in other states. Well, you don't know if that's because Utahns are more likely to get good medical advice rather than treat their depression with alcohol or other drugs, or whether the depression rate's actually higher in Utah. So it's always fun to look at a number and then try and find out what that number really means. So I'd be curious before I start showing you my numbers to hear just a few examples of statistics that maybe you've heard about Mormons that don't seem quite accurate. Anybody got an example they want to share with us? Yes, in the back.
Suicide rate in Utah is supposed to be higher.
Yeah, it is. And that's probably a believable statistic because every death gets recorded and a cause of death gets recorded, and you have a good denominator. So compared to the United States, there are more suicides. Now there's a little bit of variation. Some deaths it's not clear if it's a suicide or not. If someone had a drug overdose, it's not clear if that's intentional or not. So the medical profession has some leeway, but the suicide rate is high. In Utah, it's lower among more active members of the church, and Utah is lower than surrounding western states. There's kind of this notion of frontier mentality, people moving in, less established social structure creates higher suicide, but the rate is higher.
Bankruptcy rates.
Bankruptcy rates, now those are high, but those depend a lot state to state, because that's the state rules about who applies and whether you go and get formal bankruptcy or just don't pay your bills. But that rate, I think, is kind of...
How do you tell whether suicides are LDS or non-LDS in Utah?
You don't, but another person matched...
What was that?
how do you tell in Utah if suicides are Mormons or non-Mormons? And you can't, because the religion doesn't show up on the death certificate. Some studies have matched LDS church records with death certificates. And then you can tell to the degree the match works and the records are right. Okay, so there are a couple of studies.
And how does that turn out?
How does that turn out? That Mormons are depends on the study, but they're not low. I think that suicide should be a concern for Mormons. But we're not lower than the nation.
Usage of Prozac?
Yeah, that's the Eli Lilly data. They have the producer of Prozac. It is higher in Utah than the national average. Yeah.
Something that might mitigate that, though, is that Latter-day Saints don't use alcohol and other drugs, whereas most people can drown their sorrows. Would it not stand to reason that Latter-day Saints instead would look for prescription means?
I'm not repeating. He asked about Prozac use. I said Eli Lilly data show it's higher. And you say, well, maybe Mormons go to the doctor and get a prescription to deal with their depression, whereas other people are more likely to self-medicate with alcohol or other drugs, and that's a possibility. So you don't know the meaning of that statistic. Yeah.
No, we go to ice cream and chocolate.
She says we got ice cream and chocolate.
Oh, candy, pardon? Candy, okay.
Candy, yeah.
I want to know the statistic on that, how that...
Utah is high on Jell-O, high on ice cream, high on milk, but it's highest on, from the consumer indexes, the ingredients to make homemade cookies. Marshmallows, chocolate chips.
Ritual abuse.
Ritual abuse. As far as I know, no reliable statistic on that at all.
And Decker thinks that there's...
Higher birth rates.
Higher birth rates, yeah. If we get a chance, we'll talk about that. Definitely higher.
In view of what Mike said a moment ago about the alcohol versus Prozac, I wonder if the same might not be true concerning bankruptcies. In other words, Latter-day Saints, instead of simply being dishonest and not paying their bills, do it the legal way.
Yeah, he asked about bankruptcies. We really need credit card failures and so on compared to bankruptcy.
Divorce rates?
We'll talk about that, in a while.
Software piracy.
Software piracy, I don't know, and I don't know how you would identify it's like the suicide issue. I don't know how you would identify the religious identity of the pirate. Does BYU have the highest co-ed pregnancy rate in the country? I wouldn't be surprised if it has the highest marriage rate in the country, but there's no way that I know of to get pregnancy rates for campuses. Universities just don't provide birth rates or pregnancy rates. We've heard a lot of numbers. What we decided to do a few years ago, some colleagues and I, is compile all the national data sets that had information on Mormons so that we could get comparisons. So we have 6 major national studies, 3 of them on adolescents, 3 on adults, and we've prepared a book that's being reviewed by publishers. And we've tried to summarize how we compare with other people in 6 areas: religious participation, family life,